Thank you for making it all the way over here. I know you had to hoof it over from Moscone, so I appreciate you swinging by. Today, I want to talk about GKE On-Prem, which is all part of the new name is what? Yell it out.
Anthos.
Anthos, there we go. All right, excellent, good. The marketing is working. So we're going to talk about, and we'll obviously touch on Anthos a bit as well, because you can't talk about GKE On-Prem without a little bit of Anthos. So we'll touch on that a bit. My name is Matt Tavis. I'm a solutions architect. What that means is I spend most of my time either writing things down about how to use this stuff or working with customers and telling them how to use this stuff. So that's basically what I do. My focus specifically is in the hybrid space. So I've actually spent a fair amount of time with the PM team on the Anthos product suite, talking to them about what these products can look like, how they're going to roll out, how people should play with them. And so today, I'm going to talk a bit about GKE On-Prem. And then specifically, I'll show you that actually functioning outside of the cloud on an environment set up on packet.com. And then I'll do some demos there a little bit. And then I will turn it over to Tobias Palmborg, who's actually one of our customers, who's already used this for his business, and I'll tell you more about that. So that's the plan for this morning. So just a quick recap. Put this in here for the people that are reading on the recording. Mostly you've seen this. It's about GKE On-Prem, but also even how you can tie that into more of a CI/CD pipeline, actually how config management and Git can actually be used as a way to even control your clusters and manage them as well. So both those will be covered in today's session. So let's start with why we actually even having this conversation to begin with. So GKE On-Prem is obviously a on-prem version of GKE. Who uses GKE today? Excellent. So we got a lot of Kubernetes folks here that understand it. GKE On-Prem is the idea of bringing that to a platform other than Google. And so that's because although many people have mandated public clouds, they want to use them, 73%, but only 10% of workloads have actually moved over. So there's still almost 90% of workloads in many enterprises that are still in on-prem environments. So how do you unlock the potential of using the latest cloud technologies, but in those on-prem environments? And so some have even moved data back in some cases. So we actually have to contend with this. There's always going to be some element of hybrid in most enterprises. They're not just going to pick everything up and just move it all to the cloud tomorrow. And even if they do, it's going to be a transitional period. So hybrid is really pragmatic and persistent. And so GKE On-Prem is an opportunity to bring some of that cloud technology into your existing on-premises infrastructure. Now, that shows up in a lot of ways. There's a lot of reasons why you might have to even continue in that path over time. So for example, let's say you really want to unlock the cloud for your development teams. You want CI/CD, you want full automation pipelines, you want to use the latest tools and technologies, you want to give them dev environments that they can turn up with a snap, right? But it turns out when you go to run it in production, it's on a ship, or it's in a store, or it's in a factory, right? You actually have this split model of I need to be able to build locally in the cloud, and then I need to push to someplace else. So GKE On-Prem is giving you containers everywhere. That's that model. Another model that requires hybrid or requires this kind of mixed environment is jurisdictional. I'm writing code, but fundamentally the actual execution or even the data itself has to live in a specific location. There's rules about where it can reside. And therefore, I need the cloud technologies close to my data, which has to stay in a certain spot where maybe there isn't a cloud data center. So that's another common model. And then the third we see quite often is even this best-of-breed services. I want to run some things local against my data sets that are there, but then I also want to tap into, say, machine learning or data warehousing technologies. So I want to bridge these architectures where I have a local execution, then I actually tap into a data set in the cloud or a certain function in the cloud. And so all of these are reasons why you might actually end up having a hybrid scenario and why you might need something like GKE On-Prem. In swoops Anthos, once called Cloud Services Platform, now called Anthos. And the idea here is it's a collection of cloud services, but it's also a collection of marketplace components, and we'll see some of that. You can actually tie into the existing GCP marketplace, both for in the cloud, but also in the on-prem environment, as well as the control plane. The idea being that once you've taken this leap into using this hybrid model that goes everywhere, you can now run that the same way you'd run it on GCP. You run it on-prem with the same tools and technologies, the same backend services, and other clouds. So that is the long-term goal here. So we'll talk about how it looks today a little bit more, and so the fundamentals of that platform. But really the reason why we think this makes sense, and what we've been hearing from a lot of our customers about why this is something they want, one, it's this ability to modernize in place. I want to leverage the latest in development technologies such as containers or Kubernetes or even things like Istio for service mesh management. But I want to do it where I have my infrastructure today. I want to learn how to modernize what I have as opposed to having to move everything to the cloud first. The second reason why people are liking this approach, fundamentally, is the ability to automate policy and security at scale. So some of these components in this platform, such as, say, Istio for service mesh, for managing your access between individual components or elements in your container architecture, or config manage, which allows you to automatically apply configuration to your clusters, are about the ability to manage that sprawl that you see that starts to occur when you have microservices and containers in lots of different places. How do I keep a consistent policy on top of that? How do I have a consistent security profile and a security stance and configuration stance everywhere? That's another goal of what the Anthos platform is really focused on. And the last is really that consistent experience. Not really so much for your users, but for your operators, for your developers, and for your administrators. So they have a consistent set of tools, a consistent approach that they take everywhere. So they're not learning different technologies, different tools on each cloud or platform they use. They're learning one set, one tool chain across the board. So they're writing code the same way no matter where it runs. They're running the same kinds of scripts for automation no matter where it's actually functioning. And then ultimately you have the same dashboard of visibility of what's happening everywhere, no matter where that code is running, no matter where it's being developed or deployed. So that's fundamentally the goal of the overall platform. And this is sort of a little view into it to give you a sense of all the pieces that play in there. And we're going to talk more about the GKE On-Prem is in that bottom right, you see. That's where we've deployed some GKE to a specific cluster. But there's more to it when you look at the full platform. In terms of things like additional services, you might tap into, say, Stackdriver or Cloud Run, which was talked about this morning in the keynote. Binary authorization for the ability to sign and certify container images and code that you're deploying, right? All of those things are additional services you might add on to your deployment if you feel they're appropriate. Those can run both as sort of a split model, a little bit in the cloud, a little bit in your on-prem environment. And then there's this marketplace component I mentioned. You saw actually probably in the first day's keynote, there was a moment where they showed just drop down selecting, say, Cloud Bees and hitting a button and go, and that deploys it to your cluster. The idea is that the GCP marketplace that's there is tied directly in so you can deploy even purchased software, paid components directly to your clusters, whether they be on-prem or in the cloud. And then below that, we have that control plane layer we're going to talk a little bit about. There's three big pieces in there: config management, the connect layer, and then, of course, the service mesh, which is akin to Istio, and sort of a managed service mesh layer. GKE On-Prem is that bottom right box right there, and it's really about bringing the cloud-style automation to an on-premises model. Right, so big elements of why this makes a lot of sense is instead of patching, upgrading, and troubleshooting your cluster, you can simply rebuild and deploy. Right, it's much more automated in terms of control, in terms of getting that rolled out. And you can programmatically provision and scale that infrastructure. So because now you've got tied into the GKE On-Prem interface, which looks very much like the kubectl, there's a new thing called GKE CTL. And it will go ahead and spin up new clusters and actually upgrade versions of your Kubernetes running on top of it for you. So it does the automation of that provisioning of infrastructure as part of that. And it also will upgrade software via controllers, not manually. So now you actually are getting the deployment of the latest versions of Kubernetes, the exact same versions that are running on GKE in your on-prem environment. So there's no worries about version mismatch across your platform. And so the comparisons, if you look at it, GKE versus GKE On-Prem, I think I'll skip the GKE side because I think it sounds like a lot of folks kind of know what's out there. But big notes to make are that GKE has been in GA since August of 2015. So long-standing consumption usage pattern. It's fully managed Kubernetes control plane. Takes care of a lot of those things for you. Now on the GKE On-Prem side, you'll see now you're getting turnkey production-grade conformant Kubernetes with best practice configuration. So what that means is we're just like with GKE, where we're giving you Kubernetes versions to choose from that have been vetted and verified, same thing happens with GKE On-Prem. You're using the same versions of the open source Kubernetes platform that runs in both environments. There's an easy upgrade path. There's been validated and tested releases of Kubernetes, so you're picking something that's already been tested and verified. And of course, you will still have access to all those container services that you use in the cloud. So you can still use container registry. You can still use Cloud Build. for automation, audit logging, pieces like that, as well as Stackdriver and other services. However, you can also use your own. So there's no reason why you couldn't set up your own private container registry on-prem and point to that instead of GCR, right? There's no reason why you couldn't have your own build pipelines that you run locally and then deploy through those in your on-prem environment. So you're not tied to those services, but they're available to you. So you have flexibility and choice. I think choice is the word we used a lot yesterday to describe Anthos. Choice is what it's really about, giving you options. And of course, you have full integration with various other open source components like, say, Istio, also managed through Cloud Service Mesh, which is as part of the Anthos umbrella. Knative, which is then also talked to about as Cloud Run. So you're seeing this parallel where the open source projects are also then available as offerings through the Anthos platform, and then the marketplace solutions as well. So in terms of consistency, the GKE versus GKE on-prem, you see there's a lot of similarities here. Operating systems on-prem is Ubuntu versus the container-optimized OS. There's some minor tool differences. The console's the same, kubectll's the same, or kubectl, depending on what way you like to pronounce that. gcloud swaps out for GKE CTL, so GKE Cuttle, which allows you to spin up a new cluster, and that's how you deploy user clusters inside the environment. Calico is consistent across. You've got Stackdriver. You've got EFK in GKE on-prem, but you can also use Stackdriver logging. You can use whatever logging tools you want. For monitoring, Prometheus and Grafana are deployed automatically, but you can add Stackdriver plugins as well if you want that. So you have the ability to keep it separate and isolated, or to actually bridge it in with the existing services that GKE uses as well. What it kind of looks like, and this is what we call the cubeception model, clusters within clusters. When you were to deploy GKE on-prem, fundamentally you build out first an administrative cluster. It's that top box, right? That admin cluster has its virtual machines that are the control plane, and then actually sort of, if you will, masters in the quoted sense, air quoted sense. They are actually control plane nodes for the user clusters that then have elements that fall underneath that. So there's an admin cluster that creates other clusters, is the way to think about that. So when you go ahead and run GKE Cuttle to, say, spin up a user cluster, it will talk to that admin control plane, which works directly with, in V1, the vCenter APIs. So it works directly with the VMware vCenter APIs to automatically provision new VMs, as well as working directly with, in this case, F5, Big IP, to provision network address space and register addresses for external access to the cluster. Right? We'll cover some of the networking components in a second. But fundamentally, that is a fully automated deployment of a whole new cluster. Those images are spin up. They have Kubernetes pre-installed in them. They come online. They join the cluster. And you can actually control the size and sizing of those VMs when you deploy them. So it's all baked in a configuration that you can run once to do a dry run, and then go ahead and then deploy automatically. So then you can create multiple user clusters. So if today you might be using different clusters for different teams or different services, you do the same thing on-prem. You spin up a user cluster for Team X, a user cluster for Team Y, and then they have completely isolated clusters that you can control individually. And then you can use DHCP or static IP controls to decide how you're going to allocate addresses. So you have a little bit of control there from a networking perspective. And networking is one area where this is different. We'll cover that in just a second. Because we have this diagram, which I'm sure everyone's going to want a photo of. Don't worry, it's going to be in the video too. But the idea here is that networking is one thing that's quite different with GKE on-prem. So when you think about GKE running on the cloud, you also have, it has full control to the network infrastructure upon which it runs. That means it's allowed to set up load balancers and make sure the routing between IP ranges is set up, and the IP address rules or the IP filtering rules, firewall rules are all configured automatically for you. When you look at this running in your on-prem environment, inside the cluster, things work great. All the components inside the cluster can see each other, but then things coming from the outside have to access those services inside. So that's where there's a subtle difference, and that's why there's initially this is in my example in this slide, it's using F5. Longer term, there's a goal to bring your own load balancer that you might choose as opposed to that. So this will be a model where what happens is the when you're spinning up a cluster, it creates the node IPs, pod IPs, and service IP addresses are all automatically created based on the ranges you give it. You allocate the 10 dot range or whatever private IP range you want. And then it'll also, as part of that spin up process, allocate the ingress IP or the ingress VIP, the service VIP, and the control plane VIPs in F5. So now all of those services that you might deploy or all of the components you might deploy are accessible from outside the cluster. So other components in your network inside your on-prem data center can now see those. You choose what you expose, just like you choose what you expose in GKE by exposing a service and making it available. Same concepts. You're still exposing a load balancer, but you're choosing a particular IP range that's known by the F5 so it can actually expose that out to the rest of the data center. We'll actually take a look at that in just a second. The other thing that comes with this is because that's great, now you've got Kubernetes running in your data center, but you probably still want to see what's happening. You still want to have that kind of visibility. And so there's a component that is optional. You choose to add it. It's called GKE Connect, the hub. It is essentially something you deploy into that cluster. And what it does is it registers that cluster with the GCP platform. So now that cluster shows up in your console just like any other cluster you have running. So now you can see, oh, here's my GKE cluster in US Central 1A, and here's my GKE cluster running in on-prem, right next to each other. Dive right in. Now, the way that works is it will actually install an agent inside the GKE On-Prem cluster, and then that agent will actually dial back using a gRPC TLS connection. So it's encrypted. Dial back, you actually embed secrets in there, so it's safe. It's part of the manifest that is given to you during the registration. What happens is it will actually call back to GCP and then announce, hey, here's how I'm doing, here's my alerts, here's what's going on with my services, here's the info on my nodes and my pods and storage. All that kind of stuff is reported back up, so you can see it right there in the console if you want to. It also gives you the ability to feed deployment information back down. So from the console, you can deploy things directly into an on-prem cluster. Another thing that we're actually going to take a look at. In fact, let's take a look at that right now. So what we have here is this is the Packet environment I set up. So in Packet, all I did was, obviously this is a demo, so I didn't want to spend too much money, so I just spun up one big machine that has a lot of availability. So it's got 64 gigs of RAM, some SSDs on there, 24-core processor. So sizable, good enough to let me run my environment. What's on there, though, the most important thing that started is I've actually got VMware running on there. And so I've got an environment there set up which actually manages all the VMware infrastructure. So you can see all the virtual machines in here, just like that picture before. You've got admin workstation, you've got the F5 service appliance, you've got master nodes, the admin master nodes. You've got a network services VM that handles sort of NATing and routing between that environment. Now, this is a specific configuration for this demo. It doesn't have to run exactly like that. And then there's the user cluster component sitting there and a vCenter appliance. So that's what we have sitting in there in terms of that infrastructure. So what that gives me is the ability to go over here and say, kubectl get pods all dash namespaces. So you can see here I now have all of these individual things running automatically. I've got the GKE Connect agent already in there. That's great. I've got Istio is already pre-installed in there. We use Istio for some layer 7 routing inside of GKE On-Prem. You can obviously have a full Istio deployment as well with all the components. Alert managers, Calico is in there. You see configuration management. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Kube proxies. There's some the F5 load balancer mapping. Prometheus is in there, so you've got logging built in, baked in the cluster. Now, the other thing that happens, of course, as I mentioned, is that you can actually see this cluster directly in the console. Well, I'll reconnect that guy, and we'll come back to him in a second. So if I go back here to Kubernetes engine, I can see in my clusters that there's my user cluster 1, and my location is SJC. Right? So that's not actually a GKE or a GKE domain. And so I can jump in here, and you can actually see even on the storage information right here, like you can see this is data store 1, kube vols, VMDK. So it's mapping to the actual storage that's provided underneath the covers as part of the VMware vCenter setup. So you've got the storage in there, and then of course you even have the nodes information in here. And then so you have each of the nodes, what's available, 4 CPUs, at 8 gigs, only 2.6 is used. And I can dive into an individual node and see the actual detail of what's running. Here's all the components that are running. Here's the CPU that's available. I can even see my conditions about, is it failing any checks on disk pressure or insufficient memory, things like that. All visible right there in the console, right? I can also go ahead, and if I'm really daring, because, well, hey, why not? I'm here. The internet seems to be working. This is awesome. Let's do it. I can also just deploy stuff directly from here into that cluster. So let's just go ahead and deploy Nginx, because that's fairly straightforward. And we'll call it Nginx1. That makes sense. And there's user cluster 1. See, it's in the list is user cluster 1, which is the one that I have running on-prem. And I can go ahead and deploy right there. And then we watch and stare and cross our fingers and tap the table and cross our toes. And first green check mark, second green check mark. And I'm going to go for that. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. Waiting for pods, waiting for pods. All right, so that is deployed. So now, if I were on GKE, I could be like, oh, that's sweet. So here's Nginx1. That's awesome. I'm just going to tap in here and go, cool, let's expose it, because that's what I would do on GKE, right? Just hit expose. There's only one challenge there, which is that if you view this YAML, you'll see that there's no load balancer IP, right? So because what's going to happen in GKE is it's just going to figure it out, and it's going to give you one. It's going to fake it. No problem. It's all taken care of. GKE On-Prem, you got to be a little more specific. That's where the F5 comes in. That's where you have to say, oh, use this IP from my F5 I've pre-allocated, right? So I can't do it exactly like this. But don't worry. I've got it all figured out. Well, that's not exactly true. I don't think I've all figured out, but I got a couple things in my head going on. So let's go over here and pop into, this is that machine. And so I will do a cat Nginx service YAML. So I've got a service YAML. So the subtle difference here is that now I've got a load balancer IP at the bottom there. I picked one. So that's 10.0.10.252. Now you'll probably notice that's not routable either. But it turns out there's a funny little box that network services admin in my lab environment that does some mapping between internal and external IPs. Keeps my life straight. In a production setup, you'd actually have a load balancer out there on the edge that's actually doing the mapping from the outside to the inside IP ranges, and it'd be fine. Or you'd have a public one you could choose right here. But I can do that as I can do a kubectl apply. This is when you find out if I really know what I'm doing. It's a big test. So I just created that service, which is great. And that service is on this port right there. So there you go. Now that's the public IP range from the packet environment. That's being natted directly into the internal. So there you go. I've deployed Nginx. I've got a load balancer that's picking up that traffic and then routing it to the internal workload. I know you're stunned. Don't fall out of your chairs. All right, let's go back to the presentation. But of course, the challenge here is managing multi-cloud hybrid environments is super difficult, right? Because you've got all sorts of central IT and governance rules people want to apply. They want to make sure it's consistent everywhere. And this is just creating sprawl, right? It's adding, now a single node or cluster has multiple containers and layers of containers and microservices. It adds a lot of complexity. What they really want in central IT is this change control. They want accountability. They want, consistent environment configurations. They want to ensure consistency with a single source of truth, right? And so they want to be able to remediate problems quickly should something happen, even across multiple environments around the world. So by adding this flexibility, we're also adding complexity. So how are we going to solve that? That's the real question. So that's where Anthos config management comes in. Anthos config management, you probably saw this in the keynote. I don't know if anyone was paying attention. There was a one point in the keynote where they said git push, on one of the console screens. Anyone catch that? Anyone see the git push? Yeah. So that git push is this, right? It's config management. It's basically saying, look, let's just use git as a single source of truth. And let's make the clusters all watch a repository and then grab the configuration they need for their setup. So the idea here is you can sync your configs across all your clusters, both on-prem and in the cloud. And this enables continuous configuration of enforcement policies. So you can say, for these namespaces, for these clusters, these are the YAML files you have to apply. It's in a repo, it automatically happens. And so if things change, it'll go back and look at that repo and be like, oh, something changed, I got to update the cluster. If you try and make changes to the cluster that disagree with the repo, it will get them back to what the repo says, right? So it actually will make sure that environment stays in sync, and we'll see that in just a minute. I have more demos. Yes, I know. Get comfortable in those chairs, don't fall off. Okay. And this gives you, auditability through policy as code. So now you can also apply, your own checks, your own controls, your own pipelines on top of that repo that allow you to make sure the right people are doing it, they're going through the right checks and policies. There's even a tool associated with this that will vet your configuration before you deploy it, so make sure it actually will work, right? So there's components in there. And so the idea here, though, is it's really adopting that config as code model. It allows an Anthos admin, somebody who has access to this policy repository, to make sure they set up the environment consistently across the board. And so this is, kind of an example. As part of the docs, as this rolls out, you'll see this example. There's a policy repo. And you can see there's, Foo Corp being sort of a top-level namespace, with online being a namespace, shipping app backend being a namespace. And now the online is more virtual because there's really nothing inside of it. But as you get down to, say, shipping-dev, you see there's a job create a role binding YAML, job create a role YAML, namespace YAML, quota YAML. You're going to have a whole bunch of YAML files in here. And basically anything you can do to a cluster with a kubectl apply, YAML type command is something you could mock up as config as well. So you can actually do role bindings, you can do deployments, you can do service deployments, workloads, whatever makes sense. And so the idea here is that you can then use your classic configuration formats, the YAML files, and then go ahead and put those into Git as a repo. And then it plugs easily into your CI/CD pipeline for making sure that it's valid and correct as you go. So the way this kind of works is you might have in your GKE platform, you're going to have the config management operator. So this is implemented as a Kubernetes operator, which basically is then keeping track of a Git compliant repo, right? Your repo could be on-prem, and your GKE On-Prem has the operator installed. It's syncing against that repo, just like the GKE is as well. So if your repo is accessible to the GKE, then you can use one repo. You could also use, say, GitHub or a private Git repo if you want, deployed in the cloud, and then use that as your point as well. Also, you can use Google source repositories. So let's take a look at that. Let's jump over to the demo. All right, so that was exciting. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to install config management. So what I'm going to do is show you what that looks like. It's a pretty simple little script. All it does here is it's doing a kubectl apply, right? It's basically applying the latest version of this release. The old name was Nomos. It's not called config management. It installs a Git credentials. So I'm using SSH credentials. I've actually installed them in the cluster so that it can find those quickly so it can access the repo. And then I just apply a config management YAML. And if we cap that, you'll see that's fairly straightforward. It's pointing to, here's my user cluster, what I want to call it. Here's the endpoint, that I want you to go to, the SSH endpoint for the actual repo itself. Sync with master. Always use master. And then I'm going to use SSH for that. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to do install config management. And don't worry, there'll be an error, but that's OK. I know about that error. I've already installed the creds. They were already in there. So installing them again doesn't work, obviously. So that's now going. So what's going to happen is it's going to start immediately looking at that repo. So if I go in here, and I go back to clusters, go to workloads. Okay, there will be a couple new things in here already, and that's the config management. You can see there's the Git importer, there's a syncer, there's monitor. These are part of that config management system, and these will start and deploying themselves. Once they're in there, set up, working, they're going to start talking to that repo and then looking for what needs to happen. Now, while that's going on, because that's not instantaneous, as you can imagine, as much as I'd like it to be, I'll show you quickly kind of what that repo looks like so you get a sense of what's going on in there. There's a couple of areas in this repo that are worth noting. There's the cluster registry area. And here you can actually set up your clusters. So the reason why you might do this is because you might have different environments that have different sets of rules, and I'll show you how that plays out in the config. But you can register all your clusters here, and then as you add them, you say, oh, here's the parameters I want you to use for this cluster. That flows down into your namespace's definition to pick the right versions of elements. As an example, if we go into namespaces, and we go into the Kate's manifest, you'll see in here, if I can find it, this is all the different things that are in here. So here's the GKE On-Prem on packet, you see, right? And so what I'm doing is I'm doing a cluster selector, saying if it's a packet cluster, then I want you to do something different. And what's different here is really not much different. Down here, I added an environment platform variable that I want to show up on that cluster specifically. It changes how the code operates in that cluster. We'll see how that happens in a second. I also have, if I go down here, also on packet, I have the load balancer set up. So you'll see here I actually added the load balancer IP, like we talked about earlier. I have to have a load balancer IP in GKE On-Prem, whereas I don't have that for the on GKE. So for on GKE, it looks like this. There's no load balancer IP, right? So let's take a look and make sure that's actually happening. Let's refresh here. Okay, yeah, look, wow, it actually worked. Huh. Sorry, that wasn't shock. I apologize. That was enthusiasm. Totally different thing. No, it works fine. It works fine. Yeah. No, it's great. But it's all set up, so they're all green already. And one thing you'll notice is right here, front end external is set to load balancer 10.0.10.251:80. And so if I go to that URL, which is not here, that's not 29, but actually 28. Whoop, there you go. So we've got the hipster, or it was called hipster, now called Online Boutique. Same thing you saw in the keynote. Same app. It's actually the same code base. I just pulled it down for this environment so you can see the same thing. And you can see this on-premises here. That's because that's actually tied to where the environment's running. That's that variable I was passing in, on-prem versus GKE. So I can set that differently and set the load balancer differently for each one. And it'll work just fine. All right, let's go back to the deck. Now, that's all very exciting, and that's actually all I'm going to share with you this morning. What you probably were interested in, too, is like, what are people actually doing with this stuff? That's me showing a demo app that we built that everyone can do and download on their own, fun stuff. However, right now, I'd like to introduce you to Tobias Palmborg, who is the CTO of NetEnt, who's one of our early customers of GKE On-Prem, and he's going to tell you more about what their team did with it. Thanks, man. Yeah.
Thank you. And thanks for an awesome presentation. I mean, I couldn't do those demos, so very nice work. Thanks for having me here. I'm super keen on being here, and it's been super interesting to get an early view on GKE On-Prem as we've had. So I'm going to try and walk you through a little bit about how we're thinking about it and what we're doing with it. But first of all, so Tobias, my name, I'm CTO of NetEnt, and NetEnt, for those of you who don't know, we're a B2B company within sort of the online casino gaming industry. We produce games. I have a slot machine brand on me today. We have a number of titles that we've done. We have right now about 200 games live. So we produce those games, and we produce a platform that runs those games for our customers. And our customers, they are operators in the online casino industry. The important part here, and it's really what Matt showed before in the early slides, the reason why we're looking into this, and it's the jurisdictional reason, right? That's our main one. NetEnt has about 28 licenses across our markets. And the gambling industry is sort of going through a pretty fast re-regulation, I would say. Regulators, however, are not the most modern people right now. So going cloud is not something that we can do in all places, right? Until last year, pretty much, because then we saw a pretty big shift in some of the regulators. So cloud was more and more OK to use, right? The problem for us then was that it was only some. So if we were to go cloud at that point, we would end up in that position where you have on-prem that looks in one way, and then going cloud looks a completely different way, right? And with regards to our complexity, I'm going to go through that a little bit more later on. We kind of said that we don't want to take that path. We're not ready for that. We can't add yet another layer of complexity. So we decided to stay on-prem until we got to know about GKE On-Prem and got some early access to it. And it looks really promising. And what Matt's shown is really what's going to help us to have that sort of single control plane and still be able to use both on-prem and GKE. Just some numbers around what I call our complexity. So I said 200 customers. We build what we call a casino module for each and every customer. So each customer has at least one casino module. So we have 500 casino modules, translate into something around 3,500 VMs. So it's quite a lot to keep track of. We have 10 data centers around the world to support this and support the licenses we have. And as I said, with 200 games, adding new games, adding new customers, it's kind of like the complexity is just increasing a lot. So adding that hybrid without having really control over it would be really hard for us. These are current data centers, and we're growing. We are setting one up right now in Pennsylvania for the opening of that market. The beauty of how we see GKE On-Prem falling out is that we can set up our data centers in a different way than we've done before. So we've been working sort of with container platforms and Kubernetes for the last 2 years. And we run an OpenShift clusters in all our 10 data centers. And it's not a trivial thing to do. It's quite a lot of maintenance to do this. And we've been looking for a managed service for quite some time. And now we got it, right? So this is pretty much the sort of kind of migration path we're looking at. You see the almost the same names that we saw before on the data centers. The blue boxes are the ones that where we're going cloud. We have Finland as one example. It's a regulated market, and so happens to be that Google has a data center in Finland. So we're starting there. It's up and running. We're looking to move our admin sites, and then we're looking to build small, effective data centers for where the regulators require so, and run GKE On-Prem on them. I don't have a fancy demo as Matt has, but I have a really good video clip from a couple of weeks back when some of the developers with us managed to get the first game rounds played in GKE On-Prem. And that was really early, so it was alpha. So I want to show you that.
Let's show some workload on GKE On-Prem alpha. We start with showing that this is an ingress object that is actually in the GKE On-Prem alpha. So we now make a kube control CLA command, and we see that we now have an SPP, which is our gaming platform, and it's deployed in GKE On-Prem. Good. So let's go to the web browser, and let's visit the casino module. You can see it works. And now let's go to the admin page of the casino module. Let's log in. Here we have an internal test page for our games. We will log in with Swedish player and no password. And log in. And let's start Starburst, our most popular game. Now we are starting, and now we're playing. Yeah. So now we're playing on-prem. Okay, so that's the demo. Thank you.
So you can almost feel the excitement there, right? And it might look like just a simple game for you guys, but this is surely a game changer for us. This is going to mean a lot of stuff, or a lot of good things for us when we expand into new markets and try to modernize our platform as we've started to do. So I think that's all from me. Again, I'm really looking forward to the rest of what you guys will bring with Anthos.